this is a very early set of ideas, a very early paper. There's no imminent publication, there's no imminent article or book that's emerging from this. It's just struck me as something interesting over the summer that I wanted to explore, and I thought it would be a really good audience to explore with. My email address is on the first slide here, so do note it down. And if there's not time to ask something that you want to in Q&A and you want to correspond further about this, if you've got any ideas, I'd be really grateful to receive them, because all the help I can get is useful. I like to get as many examples and as many thoughts as I'm writing my draft. So do feel free to stay in touch after the talk as well. So what's the motivation for this paper? Why am I interested in this particular issue? Well, there's two main reasons for my interest, and there's basically two sets of debates that I've been enjoying becoming engaged with. The first one is a set of debates in democratic theory, but also in the media, about the proper place, the proper role, and the proper influence of informal representatives. Informal representatives meaning people who speak and act on behalf of others, but who haven't been formally selected to do so. So what we're really thinking about here, and I'll finesse this and give more detail soon, but what we're really thinking about here are groups like activists, charities, and so on. They're the paradigm example of informal representatives, but they're not the only ones. We all act as informal representatives at some point in our lives, and I'll talk about that later. But that's where the public debate really has been focused on. So there was a famous article in The Economist a few years ago. Well, not that famous, but there was an interesting article in The Economist a few years ago, which asked who elected Oxfam. And it was quite critical about Oxfam and its role in certain development policy issues. I think in particular relating to healthcare policies in certain African countries. And they were asking questions about whether Oxfam was meaningfully speaking for the individuals who it was professing to act on behalf of. And I think those debates are really interesting. And that's why I've titled my paper tentatively "Who Elected PETA?" Right? I mean, I could have chosen the RSPCA, I could have chosen Animal Society, I could have chosen myself, I could have chosen any organisation. So this paper is not about PETA in any way. But I've just borrowed that title to make the same point, really. So who elected PETA? Who elected any animal representatives to speak on behalf of animals? Well, no one. And we know in the animal activism case, that kind of election, that kind of selection is, if not impossible, extremely hard. So that there's this debate in the public media, but it's really sparked quite a big debate in democratic theory, and there's some really interesting literature which I'll reference at the end of this talk by Laura Montanaro, Wendy Selkin, Jennifer Rubinstein, and others, talking about the benefits of informal representation, the necessity of informal representation, but also the dangers of informal representation, the kind of problems that it can bring about. And I want to get involved in those debates, but with the kind of animal focus. So this leads me to the second reason why I'm particularly interested in this, and that's because I've spent a lot of time, as Thomas pointed out, in recent years arguing for the political representation of animals. And I know this is something that you've been discussing and will continue to discuss over future months. But when I've been doing that, in terms of my advocacy for political representation, I have been thinking as a kind of politics scholar, you know, I'm based in a politics department, I'm thinking about institutions. I've been thinking about the formal representation of animals. So I've been in my books advocating for example, legislatures having a portion of seats reserved for animal representatives. And those representatives should be selected by a particular process involving proxies who act on behalf of animals and so on and so forth. But it's very much about a formal selection process and a formal active representation within a public institution. But of course, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Hopefully it will happen at some point, but it's not going to happen at any time soon. So we do need to think about the kind of representation we offer to animals now, which is informal representation. There's a lot of that going on. And even if we did get to some kind of animal utopia and had formal animal representation, we'd still need informal representation as well, right? Informal representation is kind of inevitable. That kind of activism, agitation, and just speaking on behalf of others can't be avoided sometimes, particularly for animals. So we need to think about the informal representation of animals because it's ubiquitous and it's here to stay. But if there are dangers to informal representation, which they are, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about them today, then we need to mitigate those dangers if we think the benefits of informal representation are important to us, which I will argue that they are. Okay, so that's the motivation behind the paper. And as I said right at the start, it's very early days, and I'm just thinking through some of these ideas. What I'm doing really in this paper is just bringing some of the debates that are going on in the literature to the animals issue. So it's quite simple at this stage. I guess before we get onto that, we should define what we're talking about with regards to formal and informal representation. I've kind of given a hint of it, but I think we need to put a little bit more flesh on the bones. So formal representation is when a person or group is selected by means of a systematized electional procedure and speaks or acts on behalf of some individual or group besides themselves. So paradigmatically, our political representatives in legislatures are formal representatives. That's a form of formal representation. So my member of parliament in the House of Commons, for example, is a formal representative. There's a systematic procedure, a general election, where I select individuals, and then the person that wins that election wins and goes and acts as my representative in Parliament. But of course, it's worth pointing out that formal representation is not just limited to the political arena. When we select representatives to speak for us at work, or perhaps at our social clubs or our sports clubs, there's also these kinds of systematic procedures. And so that would count as formal representation too, because informal representation is precisely when there's not those kinds of systematic procedures. So informal representation is when a person or group is not selected by means of systematized election or procedure, but nevertheless still speaks or acts on behalf of some individual or group besides themselves. So paradigmatically, groups like Oxfam or PETA or any other NGO or activist group is usually acting as some kind of representative informally. They may represent groups like the poor or the marginalized, like animals, and they'll speak and act on behalf of them, conveying and promoting their interests, but they won't have been selected by the individuals who they are representing. But of course, informal representation isn't just limited to activist organizations, NGOs, and charities. We all, as humans, are likely to act as informal representatives at some stage in our lives. And I'll talk about the ubiquity, the necessity of informal representation in just a few minutes. Now, it is also worth pointing out that sometimes these categories, formal and informal, can become a bit blurred. There's an analytic distinction, but in practice, sometimes there can be a bit of blending and crossover, and that shouldn't worry us too much. One kind of interesting example in the animal case of a slight blurring is perhaps the RSPCA, because actually the trustees of the RSPCA are selected in a formal procedure. They're selected by the members who vote and put them in place. I think that's right anyway. So there is a kind of formal procedure there which would lend it towards a kind of formal representation. And yet the RSPCA, while it does act to represent its members, it also acts to represent animals very often. So, and it's not the animals who are selecting those trustees. So I still think that while it's a bit blurry, we could put an organisation like the RSPCA within the informal representation side. But it's worth pointing out that things are sometimes a little bit of both. So why is informal representation inevitable? And it's particularly inevitable when it comes to the representation of animals. Well, we all speak for others sometimes. We all speak for other individuals or groups at some point in our lives. Just think about how you might represent a child of yours, you know, advocating for them, I don't know, at school or amongst a peer group, or, you know, maybe your parents, an elderly parent, perhaps, who you might have to act as a representative for, or indeed your friends or your workplace. People might ask you, oh, what does the University of Sheffield think about this? Or your city, or, you know, what are the people of this city or that city think? You know, people might ask you, and you act as a representative of that, just colloquially, just in conversation. I mean, you may even be asked to act as a representative sometimes on behalf of your state, your political community. You know, when you're traveling, for example, people often ask, you know, well, how do people in Germany feel about this? What's going on with those elections that happened a couple of days ago? Or France? You know, when I was traveling around Europe just a few years ago, people would often ask me, you know, what's going on with Brexit? Right? Where are the British people at? They were asking me to be a representative of the British people, but I wasn't selected by the British people to be a representative. So this was informal representation. So it's a perfectly normal and inevitable process. And sometimes, and this is something interesting that Wendy Selkin has pointed out, sometimes individuals and groups are conscripted to speak for others. They haven't chosen to act as a representative, but other people kind of make them a representative. So those individuals might not want to be a representative. They may not mean to be a representative, but what matters, Selkin points out, is whether people take them to be a representative. So when people perhaps ask me about, you know, British attitudes towards Europe after Brexit and so on, I may not want to speak on behalf of the nation. I may be particularly bad at speaking on behalf of the nation. But if the audience, the person who's asked me, takes what I say seriously, then I'm acting as an informal representative, a conscripted informal representative, which is interesting. Now, worth pointing out that the informal representation of animals is ubiquitous. So I've already spoken about how this is what many animal NGOs and activists are doing, but also animal scholars. So people like myself are acting as informal representatives of animals. Sometimes I've done that quite explicitly when I'm discussing, you know, what interests animals have and what interests animals do not have. Sometimes more implicitly when I'm making assumptions about what animals want, but I'm still speaking and acting on behalf of them in many ways. Those of us who live with companion animals have to act as an informal representative. Not just when we're, you know, perhaps taking them to the vets or for medical care, you know, just talking about them with friends and family. One of the great things about living with a companion animal is talking about their preferences and their wants and their peculiar preferences and wants in comparison to other animals that we might have lived with, talking about their habits and their personalities, representing who they are to other people. That's informal representation. But it's also worth pointing out that those who use animals for certain ends can also be animal representatives, and frequently are. So even those who we might not ordinarily regard as advocates for animals, groups who might promote hunting, agriculture, or animal research, also speak for animals often in their literature and in their public discourse. We, meaning perhaps us in this room, might not like what they have to say about animals' needs and wants, but they often still do represent some version of what they think animals need and want. They're claiming to speak and act for animals. They are representing animals. So I think that highlights that representation can be contested, and the quality of representation can be contested. And that's true right in the human case. Like, just think about your political representatives, or think about when you've been represented by, you know, a colleague at work, or you know, maybe your parents when you're a child. You know, sometimes we might not like how we're represented, and that's a normal facet of representation, and one to bear in mind, I think, as we're going through and thinking about it today. Okay. Let's now talk about the benefits of informal representation. I think these are really important to emphasize and to make clear, because I'm going to spend more time looking at the dangers, because that's where the literature is at, and that's where that public media debate about Oxfam and so on came from. But we only want to mitigate those dangers if we think the benefits of informal representation are worth it. And the benefits of informal representation, particularly for animals, are very important, because a lot of people point out that the benefits of informal representation for individuals and groups who lack formal representation, so don't have members of parliament acting on their behalf, or don't have representatives in other important decision-making fora, it's very important that they get some kind of representation, because they lack it in those institutions. So informal representation for those groups that are excluded or marginalized from formal political procedures can often be a lifeline. And obviously that is the case with animals. They don't have, in spite of my advocacy, a quota of representatives in the House of Commons or any other legislature. So the role of activists and informal representatives is going to be crucial. Why? Well, there's a few reasons, and I've listed them down here. To voice the interests of those who are represented, to voice the interests of animals. So putting the interests of animals into public and political life, interests that weren't known about before or weren't taken seriously before. And this is hugely important for individuals and groups who can't do it themselves, who can't take their interests to the public arena or the political arena themselves. And so that's going to be tough for animals to do. It's also important to make the group visible. So not just putting specific interests on the table, but an informal representative can actually put the group themselves on the table. So make the group visible. The informal representation can identify and amplify a group in the minds of the powerful, such as a sexual minority or a racialized group or a species of animal or any other interest group. It can be an informal representative that can say, look, this group exists and they're suffering in this way, or they need this particular set of goods. And so they can make others aware that this group is a group and has a stake in certain issues. So that's really important too for animals. Another benefit of informal representation is raising group consciousness. This is one that's often discussed in the literature. So in some cases, such representation can solidify the group's own self-understanding that they are a group. So they may not be fully aware that they do constitute a particular group with certain shared interests. So this idea is particularly important in socialist thought, where representation of class interest is held to be crucial for identity formation and the political motivation of the working class. So here's the idea that we need some kind of like vanguards to raise class consciousness. It's also true with other groups, to make groups aware that they are a group and they have some kind of shared interests. This benefit, I think, is probably a little bit less relevant for animals, because it's unclear that they can understand themselves to belong to a shared political group with common interests and goals. I think it's fair to say they don't have that ability to understand themselves as such. But there may be a role for informal representatives in raising group consciousness kind of in interspecies groups. So raising group consciousness amongst, say, human citizens, that they share a community with other animals, whether that be domesticated animals or certain wild animals, that they are that they have certain shared ends, and they have certain, entangled fates is a word that I've used in my previous work before. And so informal representatives could have an important role there in raising a kind of group consciousness that's interspecies. I need to think more about that, but I think that's interesting. The final benefit of informal representation is the act of being a communicative conduit with policymakers. So we need informal representatives to get stuff done. So informal representatives don't just kind of say, here's what this group wants and needs, and then run away. They lobby, they agitate, they negotiate, they bargain with policymakers, those in power, to seek effective change. So that's what I mean by a communicative conduit. They take the interests to the powerful, but they also engage with the powerful to try and get stuff done. And this is the goal of advocates of all stripes, and it's clearly the goal of animal advocates and animal representatives too. So these are pretty big benefits, and they're pretty important for animals, because animals lack that kind of formal representation. They can't fall back on their MP. They can't fall back on other individuals who will be speaking for them in decision-making bodies. So informal representation is, to use a word I mentioned before, a lifeline. But there are some dangers of informal representation. A lot of the literature is based on that and in discussing that. So what I'm going to do is just run through these dangers over the next 5 minutes or so, dangers that have been identified in the literature, and then I'll apply them to animals and see how they relate to animals. And I think that they do relate to animals. Each of these dangers does have some bearing on the animal case too. And in fact, in some of these cases, the danger is even more acute when it comes to animals. Okay, so there's even more problematic when it comes to the informal representation of animals. So what I've done is I've kind of grouped the dangers that informal representation compose into three kind of sets, if you like. We'll take, and there's a slide on each set. So what are these dangers? Well, the first one is that informal representation might violate the interests of the represented. Informal representation might violate the interests of the represented. Now, that might just seem a bit counterintuitive to you. How could that be so? When representation is about speaking or acting on behalf of the represented group, how could it set back their interests? Well, quite simply, representation can be bad. It can be wrong. It can be ignorant, right? That could be intentional on the part of the representative. They might be deliberately doing bad representation, or it could be unintentional. It doesn't matter for our purposes. The point is mainly that representation can be problematic for individuals. It can set back their interests in important ways. And that's also true in the case of animals. So more specifically then, how can representation be bad? How can it violate the interests of the represented group? Well, first of all, the representative could deny that the represented group possesses interests which they do have. So the representative could deny that the represented group has interests which they do have. So think about, let's apply this to the animal case. Think about claims that animals have no interest in life, no interest in continued life. So that's a claim that's made in certain elements of the agricultural industry, but also by philosophers. And the claim is something along the lines of, yeah, animals may have an interest in not being made to suffer, but they don't have the kinds of cognitive capacities to care about continued existence, or to understand continued existence. They don't have an interest in continuing to live. Now, if that representation, if that claim is believed, if it has traction, if it has influence amongst policymakers, and if it's false, then that representation is helping to violate the interests of animals. That representation that they don't have this interest, when in fact they do, leads to a violation or can help to lead to a violation of their own interests. And in my own work, I deny that certain animals have certain interests. I've claimed, for instance, that animals have no interests in not being used for certain purposes. So I've claimed that as long as animals aren't harmed by being kept as a companion or hunting for truffles in the woods or sniffing out dry rot, then no interest is violated. If they're not suffering or being killed in those roles, then they're not harmed. And if that claim that I've made in my work, that representation of animals, is believed, if it has traction, influence amongst policymakers, and if I'm wrong, if it's false, then my representation of animals has helped to violate the interests of animals. My representation has stood in the way of, abolitionist claims that we should get rid of all animal use, for example. So that's just another example of how denying that animals have a particular interest incorrectly can set back their interests. Secondly, the second way in which a representative could violate the interests of those that they represent is by claiming that they have interests which they in fact do not have. So think about the claims of some zoos, for example. They sometimes argue that members of rare species, or any species, but let's concentrate on members of rare species, suffer so much in the wild, such a terrible and bad place, that they have an interest in being provided with food, shelter, protection, and healthcare within the context of a zoo. They have an interest in being looked after in a zoo, being taken out of the wild. Now, if that claim, that representation of those rare species interests is believed, if it has traction and influence, and if it's wrong, if it's false, then that representation could play a role in violating the interests of animals, because it would encourage people to keep putting them in zoos and policymakers to allow it. Finally, a representative could attribute the wrong weight to the interests of those that they represent. So in this scenario, going back to animals, a representative might identify the correct interests of the animal, but might give them the wrong weight or the wrong importance, and which, if believed, and if it has traction and influence, could harm those animals. So think, for example, about hunters, for example. They might acknowledge that animals can suffer. They might acknowledge that animals have an interest in continuing to live, but they might say that interest is really not very important. The animal's interest doesn't matter too much, particularly given the other interests at stake, the other values at stake, like, I don't know, our interest in eating, or our interest in dealing with overpopulation, or in biodiversity, or something else. Now, if those hunters are wrong in their claim, and if their claim has had some influence in what people do, then that could lead to the violation of animal interests. So just to be really clear here, and with all these examples, my aim has not been to take any sides in these debates about animals' interests and what they are and how they should be weighed. It's rather to point out to you, which hopefully it's clear now, that it's perfectly possible for informal political representation, and indeed formal political representation, to lead to the violation of interests. Okay, speaking and acting for and on behalf of others doesn't always lead to good results. It can lead to bad results. Okay, so that's the claim I wanted to make there. So that's the first danger of informal representation of animals. It can violate their interests. The second danger is that it might bring about, reinforce, or exacerbate problematic, unequal relations between the representatives and the represented group. So I'm calling them, as a shorthand, oppressive relations, but I'm only using that word in a very loose, non-technical way. So informal representation can lead to unequal and oppressive relations between the represented and the representatives. I think this is a big concern. This is one of the biggest concerns of those critics of international NGOs like Oxfam, referring to that debate I was talking about earlier. They worry, these critics, that well-intentioned activists working in affluent countries, speaking and acting on behalf of marginalized communities in poor countries, these critics worry that this can end up cementing quite unequal and oppressive relations between the two groups. So is this a worry, and is it a worry when we're thinking about the informal representation of animals? If so, how? Well, we might worry about informal political representation leading to unequal relations because the representatives might overpower, exclude, or displace the marginalized represented group. So the idea here, I think, is that representatives might end up silencing or excluding those whom they represent. By the act of representation, they're preventing the individuals themselves, the represented group, coming forward and putting forward their case. So the attention from the public or from those in power goes to Oxfam or goes to Bono or goes to whatever the group is, rather than to the poor and marginalized communities themselves. And that's problematic because the groups themselves might articulate better what they want, or it might just be intrinsically valuable that they should be able to articulate what they want, right? Rather than having to go through a conduit. So does that apply to animals? Can their representatives displace their own voice? It doesn't seem quite the same, given that animals don't have the same capacities for political agitation as humans do. Animals need some form of representation from humans. They can't express or they can't act politically in exactly the same way that humans can. However, animals can nonetheless express their preferences, express their interests, and they can express their dissatisfaction themselves. And that's crucial to doing right by them. And we don't want to draw attention away from them expressing their own preferences, interests, and dissatisfaction. We don't want to always have to refer to their representatives to understand what they want. So I think it can be an issue with regards to the representation of animals. The second way in which informal representation can lead to oppressive relations is that it might lead to the represented groups relying on their representatives too much. That is being dominated really by their representatives. The idea here is that represented groups can't foster their own forms of political participation and agitation when these representatives are doing everything for them. They step in and they dominate. This is again a worry with the larger NGOs and charities in the human sphere, that they're really kind of suppressing or dampening down the local forms of activism. That could certainly be a danger for animals for the reasons stated earlier. Given that they can express their preferences, interests, and dissatisfaction, we don't want them becoming just too reliant. They need to rely on informal representatives to some extent, but we don't want them to be over-reliant on them. We also want them to be able to express themselves and to be listened to directly. So that's an interesting balance that we have to serve. They do rely on informal representatives, but we don't want that reliance to be too heavy. We don't want them to be dominated. We don't want them to be drowned out by the representative groups. We need access to, as a public and as policymakers, we need access to the animals themselves as well. The final way in which informal representation might be oppressive and leads to these unequal relations is homogenization. So a clear way of oppressing a group is to kind of flatten them, particularly with regards to representation. So to regard them as all the same, or to represent them as all the same, to ignore the nuances and differences that exist with any group. So, you know, this is what women want. This is what the British people want. And representation is a really tricky business because it needs to be alive to difference and nuance, which is often hard to achieve. And very often it's not, it homogenizes. And this danger, I think, is particularly acute with animals and the role of the animal representative. What does it mean to be an animal representative? Can an animal representative really do justice to the diverse interests of all animals, all species, from the goldfish to the gorilla? Can they speak for all of them? Can they exist? Can they speak for all animals who exist within and are used in such a variety of contexts? You know, from the rare platypus of Tasmania to the, you know, abundant cockapoos that live in the houses on my street. You know, can an animal representative do all that work, or will it lead to a flattening, treating them as a homogenous group? So that's another danger which I think is alive in the case of the informal representation of animals. The final danger with regards to the informal representation of animals is that it lacks legitimacy. And this one's been much discussed within the literature, and it's the idea that, you know, with formal representation and the selection procedure that's involved, there's some kind of legitimacy that the representatives have. But in informal representation, without that systematic procedure, that legitimacy can be lacking. And I think this problem is quite stark in relation to animals. So to think about it more, what are the different understandings that might ground the legitimacy of representation in and of itself? Why might a representative be legitimate? How can a representative have legitimacy? Let's go through them and then see if informal representatives, particularly of animals, lack it or not. And I think we'll find out that there's some reasons to be worried here. So one reason a representative can get legitimacy is by being authorized by the individual or group they represent. So I authorize a lawyer to act on my behalf. They have legitimacy to speak for me. I participate in an election where my MP gets elected. They have legitimacy. But such processes are missing in informal representation. What is more, they must be missing when it comes to animals, because animals cannot authorize anyone to speak on their behalf in the same way that humans can. So this source of legitimacy is unavailable to them. Representatives can also hold legitimacy by being held accountable. That might be through election and the threat of deselection, or it could be through some kind of transparency about what they're doing and saying and the public scrutiny that follows. The latter is possible with informal representation. So public scrutiny and accountability is possible with informal representation. We can see what they're doing and they can make what they're doing available and we can judge it. But for animals to do that, for animals to judge whether their representatives are doing it in good ways is extremely difficult. So again, we seem to have a bit of a problem here when it comes to accountability of representatives and animals. Another way in which a group might or a representative might have legitimacy is by being a member of the same group as the represented. So this is why many people think that it's important that women are represented by women and that Black interest groups are led by Black people and so on. But clearly representatives of animals need to be humans. So that shared group identity is not possible. So again, we have another problem when it comes to the legitimating factors of representation. And that's why I think many advocates of animal representation have fallen back to epistemic legitimacy. So they say that animal representatives can have legitimacy when they know the right stuff, when they have good knowledge of the represented group. They have a special knowledge about their interests and what they want. That's the epistemic criterion. Martha Nussbaum's a good example of this. She states, I'm quoting, "To get the pertinent issues on the table, we need to listen to many stories of animal lives told by experts who have lived closely with a certain type of animal and study those animals over long periods of time." But there's problems here still. How do we identify those experts? What's the source of their expertise? How do we know that they are the experts? Is living with and studying individuals an assured way of identifying the interests in the right way? Many of you might have lived with people for a long time and they never got you. Think about many kids and what they say about their parents. My parents don't get me, right? It's not living with someone doesn't necessarily mean you're the best representative of them. And while many animal behaviorists, scientists may know many things about the animals they study, their wants and their needs, that doesn't mean they've got a full grasp of all of their interests. Do they know about their interests in liberty and life, whether they prioritize freedom over suffering, whether they prioritize companionship over bodily health, and so on. Because ultimately, these are philosophical and political questions, not scientific. Science might help, but it doesn't provide all the solution. So deferring to experts who study animals and know them well isn't necessarily going to solve all of our problems here. Okay, so they're the three dangers of informal representation. I think they all apply to animals, and in some cases apply more acutely to animals, particularly when we're thinking about things like authorization and accountability for legitimacy there. How might we tackle them? Well, there's various possibilities. One way is to downgrade representation a little bit. And there's two options here that I'm just going to quickly run through. I'll do it quickly because I don't think they ultimately work. But both, I've grouped them both together because I think they share something, and they try and shy away from representation a little bit. So maybe one of the problems is that we see representation as inevitable for animals in a way that we don't for humans. So yes, humans are represented politically all the time, but they can also speak for themselves. Humans can also participate politically. They can write petitions, run for office, march on the streets, write blogs, debate with fellow citizens. Individual humans can represent their own interests. They don't have to be represented. Animals can't. They don't have those same capacities. Now, some scholars have denied this. They argue that animals can participate and even co-author laws. They say if we have a less rationalistic, more embodied understanding of participation, we can see that animals can participate just by existing and acting and behaving in particular ways, in particular arenas. If correct, maybe we can overcome the problems of representing animals by not doing so much representation and rather promoting animal participation. So finding ways to facilitate animals' participation rather than representation. And some in the scholarship have argued that when it comes to the informal representation of humans, that's what we should be aiming for. Not so much representation, but partnership with participating human individuals. I don't think that this alternative helps us much. One, I think it overestimates the political agency of animals. I think it exaggerates what their capacities are. But even leaving that debate aside, I think in the end, there's always going to have to be representation. It's not an either or, partnership or representation. As the advocates of animals' political agency acknowledge, it needs to be accompanied by collaborators, micro boards, or other conduits of animal interests. Activists are going to have to represent animals at some level. We can't just leave it up to animals to participate themselves, because then, unfortunately, in this world where we exist, nothing would get done to promote their interests. It's going to have to go through a human acting in the political arena. So representation is inevitable. So we can't just wish away the problems that representation bring about. The second option is to move away from representation and to think more about governance. So Jennifer Rubinstein has argued that actually NGOs and charities do much more than representation. They also wield power. They try and influence the public debate, and they try and influence policymakers. They're not just representing other groups. So she asks, what we should be doing is not, is their representation good or bad, but is their exercise of power good or bad? I also don't think that can help us too much, because I think ultimately, even though she's right that NGOs and charities are doing things more than representation, they are also doing those things alongside representation. So often when NGOs and charities and activists, for example, are trying to influence the public and trying to influence policymakers, they're doing so through representation. They're using representative tools to do so. They're speaking on behalf of animals in many cases. They're putting forward their claims and their interests. Okay, So I don't think we can just wish away representation. I think representation is here to stay. I think informal representation is here to stay. And then that leads us to wonder about those dangers. Can we mitigate any of those dangers that I referred to? And so for the final 5 minutes or so, I want to talk about some ways, and this is quite tentative here, and this is where I could use some help. I want to think about ways in which we might try and mitigate those dangers, try and perhaps sometimes solve them, but if not solve them, try and downgrade the extent of the dangers that I've just identified. So how can we ensure or hope that informal representatives don't violate the interests of animals? Because remember that the problem was that representatives can deny that they have interests they have, they can ascribe them interests that they don't have, or they can give the wrong weight to their interests. Well, this is really tricky to resolve given our uncertainty, a kind of radical uncertainty about the interests that animals have. We can never be totally sure about the full content of animals' interests because we obviously can't just go and ask them to find out, nor can they just tell us. But I think there's a useful idea we can apply to animals here. One thing we can do is assess whether the representatives of animals took due care to understand and find out what the interests of animals are and are not. That could be demonstrated by some kind of close relationship with the animals involved that was fostered. It could involve studying them, could involve careful argumentation. But a red flag, I think, to possibly bad representation would be no such steps, just saying animals want this, and no evidence that any careful scrutiny or consideration had been put into that conclusion. We can also, and I think this is important, ask ourselves about conflicts of interest on the part of the representative. Has the representative any stake or material interest in attributing or denying the interests that they do to animals? So if someone from the meat industry is saying that animals have no interest in not being killed because they're made for human consumption, we might have reason to be wary given the conflict of interest, right? It doesn't totally rule out that what they're saying might have some legitimacy, but if they've not done the kind of due diligence that I was talking about in terms of study and care, and if they have that conflict of interest, then I think we'd have good reason to at least be skeptical about their claims. How then might we avoid the oppressive relationships that can emerge between the represented group and the representatives? Recall here that the concern was that representation can lead to displacing them, dominating them, leading to reliance, or homogenizing them. Well, when it comes to displacing or dominating animals, Wendy Selkin has put forward this really interesting idea about democracy within duties. So she says it's really important that representatives fulfill their democracy within duties, which are duties to the represented group. And they're really duties of consultation, duties to go out and speak with, to tell the represented group what they're doing, and to listen to the represented group and hear what their interests and wants are. So that kind of relationship is really important. Is that kind of consultation possible with regards to animals? Well, I think it is. I think while humans to some extent must act as their conduits politically, animals themselves can't participate directly. Animals can still participate as agents with a voice that we need to listen to. They can still be consulted. So being a good representative for animals and having an accurate account of their interests is to facilitate their voice and to listen to them. And I think that consultation should help us avoid homogenization too, where, remember, the interests of a diverse group can be flattened. But also to avoid homogenization, I think we can just ask ourselves if the representative is maybe taking on too much in terms of the numbers of animals or the diverse species or the different contexts in which animals exist. And if we think that they are maybe trying to represent too many types of animal, maybe we might be worried about the quality of the representation they can offer to all animals within that group. Just as we worry about, the size of constituencies that we have in our political communities at the moment. I don't think my MP can do a very good job in representing me, given the size of my constituency, for example. So how might we tackle the danger of the lack of legitimacy? How might we respond to that danger? Well, recall here that the danger is that informal representatives might lack legitimacy because they lack authorization, they're not accountable, and they lack that shared group identity. And then there's also finally those worries about, epistemic uncertainty. How can we just be confident that the experts are out there who know this stuff? Can these problems be mitigated then? Well, when it comes to authorization and accountability, it's hard to achieve fully with animals because they can't vote. Animals themselves can't select and hold accountable those who speak on their behalf. And that is a problem. But I don't think it's completely insurmountable. One thing we might say is that this form of authorization is partially achievable at the formal level. So I've advocated for formal representatives for animals in legislatures who are selected by proxy voters. That would allow a kind of authorization and accountability to exist. So maybe one role of informal representatives is to agitate for formal representatives where that kind of accountability and authorization is clearer. But even just sticking with informal representation per se, I think consultation, what we were talking about earlier, could be useful in this case too. Consultation does not provide a way for animals to authorize or hold accountable their representatives, but for us as the audience of what's going on, us as the public, the audience of representation, we can make judgments on the quality of the representation that the representatives are offering. We can hold representatives accountable by asking about the content and quality of what they are doing. Are they seeking to understand the interests of animals in the right ways? Are they consulting with them in appropriate manner? Are they seeking out animals and listening to what they're saying? Are they looking at the best evidence, both scientific, but also the philosophical arguments? So we can use public scrutiny here to shine a light on the representation. And that does afford some accountability and hence some legitimacy. Shared identity, remember that was another possible source of legitimacy. Clearly that's not possible with animals, but nevertheless, there may be scope for some kind of politics of presence amongst animal representatives. So why the representatives themselves can't be animals, we might think it's important that they're surrounded by animals. Perhaps their offices should include animals within them so that the presence of animals is always felt by their representatives and felt keenly. So maybe animal activists should open up their offices and let the animals in, which many of them do quite rightly. And I think that's really interesting. Finally, then, epistemic legitimacy. That's the idea that legitimacy is grounded from having that knowledge. And remember, the problem was, well, who do we know how do we know who the knowledgeable are? Well, I think we have some tools to at least make some headway here. Again, we can ask, maybe the knowledgeable are those who are doing the consulting, those who are seeking out and engaging with the animals themselves. Maybe those, maybe the better representatives are those without a conflict of interest, those who don't have a material gain from representing animals in this way or that. But ultimately, I think when it comes to epistemic legitimacy, we must accept that some kind of contest about the content of animals' interests is inevitable. And these are inevitable because they're political and philosophical questions as much as scientific. But that's a reason for us and a reason for representatives to engage in those political and philosophical debates, to deliberate, to listen, and to fight our corner. And if such deliberation is taking place in an open way, and if the representatives are engaged with that, then that enhances their representative legitimacy, surely. Now, one other possibility, of course, is that in the face of this contestation and this lack of certainty about what animal interests are, perhaps animal interests should just focus down on the very basics, on the kind of consensus, if you like. Maybe that would be more legitimate. For instance, we know, and there is a consensus about animals' interest in avoiding suffering. So maybe the animal representative's role should be just to focus down on that and worry less about their interests, perhaps in liberty or life, and just focus on the most egregious forms of suffering that animals endure, whether that be in factory farming or so on. I don't know. I'm less convinced by that response to this epistemic legitimacy problem. I'm not sure that it's obviously the best form of representation. Aiming for a richer representation seems better in the human case, for example. We don't want our representatives just trying to stop us from starving, for example. We want them to do more in order to help us achieve a good life. And I think my hunch is that that's the same with animals. Okay, in conclusion, informal representation of animals is important because it's valuable, has many benefits, and it's here to stay. Representatives and their audiences need to recognize, however, though, its dangers. And because of the benefits, we need to try and come up with ways of mitigating those dangers. How? Well, I've just given a few loose and tentative initial ideas. I think we need to recognize that representation can never be perfect and only be partial, and it will be contested, but we should accept and engage with that contest, focusing on the best evidence and arguments for the content of animal interests. And that the best evidence and arguments will often come from animals themselves. So looking for representatives who are engaged in consultation and seeking out the voices of animals is really important. And while authorization and accountability is particularly problematic for informal animal representatives, it is important for legitimacy. And in that regard, I think trying to increase that through the agitation for formal representatives is another important role for informal representatives to engage with. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm just going to pop up just for a few seconds some of the references I've used, which are debates from within the literature on democratic theory, which I referred to before, because I was really using a lot of these arguments and plugging them into the animal issue as I've been going along. Okay, thanks everyone.